from a text that is over 2,000 plus years old. I thank you for your word that is forever settled in heaven. I ask God that you would give us insight and understanding, that we may learn and that we may help others in instructing that from this text. We ask this, Father, in your name. Amen. All right. Before we begin class, normally what I would do at this particular juncture, I would ask if there are any questions that you have from your readings thus far. Anything related to paper topics. I know I've been getting a couple emails from students about papers. And so I'll open up the floor if you have any questions.
Well, between the 7 executioners and the 5 deadly sins, which one would you suggest I do?
Sorry, you're really garbled.
Between the 7 executioners or the 5 deadly sins, which one would you suggest?
the last email exchange. Yeah. They're both actually very good as far as topic wise. The 7 executioners. There are a number of sources in the textbook that can help you on your way there. I mean, I just chose 5. I just said, give me 5. I'm open to either one. You'll probably find the most sources on the latter when you're dealing with the sins. In other words, what are the big issues? We're going to talk a little bit about that today at the opening of the class before we get into Ezekiel, because that's going to set the context of why Ezekiel is giving his message. And so you're going to see there's a variety of sins, actually, that they commit. And that's why I said if you go too broad, it can become unwieldy, and I don't want you to be kind of trudging through all of that material. I'd rather keep it as focused as possible. That way, that's what I said, choose like 3 or 5 or something like that, kind of the big picture stuff. All right? And something like that would be very helpful in making the application to modernity, right? Because if you look at the 3 or 4 big sins, is there any parallel? And I think that you could probably see a lot of parallels between what's going on. You would say, well, the number one thing is idolatry. Well, okay, so they may have been worshiping stone and wood, stone, and metal. But what's society in spiritual formation today? What is it that you're ministering to, and what type of idols, quote unquote? So you can make the connections.
Yeah, like today's idols would probably be money and technology.
Yeah, I mean, there could be a variety of things. And the thing is to make, and this is where when you're doing a paper, and this is for everybody, when you're doing a paper and you're trying to make application, you want to make it as close as possible. So in other words, if idolatry is the number one thing that's driving the sins of ancient Judah, what would you say is the number one driving thing or sin that's affecting your particular, especially if you're applying it to a nation, United States or whatever? And that's kind of the way you would think through it. Make sense? Okay. Are there any other questions? Yes, Ed.
Can you hear me okay?
Just turn a bit. And
I probably need to turn.
Yeah, that's better.
So the P source, are there some that feel that the P source is something other than Leviticus, like a book that we don't have today?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. That's why I think the way I worded is the majority of it. Yeah, I say the language portions of Leviticus, it does reflect that. But the P source is also, it has material all the way across the Pentateuch. But what I was dealing with in this particular context is the fact that Ezekiel likes, as a priest, he seems to like the law codes, and in Deuteronomy, and he seems to like kind of the priestly language. And so when we, for example, get over to chapter 16 of Ezekiel, and we start addressing Israel as a unfaithful wife, it's amazing the number of connections that it has to Leviticus chapters 18 and 20, because those are the sexual laws for Israel, and he draws upon those. Excuse me. So he seems to like to draw upon the priestly source. And I use that language only in a scholarly sense. I do not feel that this material was all chopped up the way it was. The way scholars say, I think that it's still Mosaic. I think that it's reflecting what we call it, holiness or whatnot. It's still reflecting language or law that Moses gave the people. I'm just using the language that most scholars use. So when you're studying or looking at commentaries, you understand what I mean when you use that language because they use it. I play the game. Anything else? Yeah, I just heard it came in. It just binged. Okay, and so for the others, if you have paper ideas you want to me, let me know. So anything else? Any questions before we move on? Are we both?
So.
All right. I can't remember. I actually assigned the extra biblical text on the vision of the netherworld.
Yeah.
Did that assigned?
Yeah.
The reason I did that is to into the ocean down, and kind of the language used in some, I think in a lot of cases reflects some language that Ezekiel is using because he's speaking in the context. So he's going to be using their language. One of the things, and Lynn, I don't know whether you can actually pull up the PowerPoint slide. I'll see that behind me. It's the one on the nature of treaty and covenant. Yes, that one. So as long as the students can see it, I can pull mine up here and I can talk through it.
Okay. Can y'all see that clear enough, or you want me to use the other version?
Is that good? Yeah, you can pull that down so I don't have to see it, because I have my own on my side. I'd rather see the students' smiling faces. There we go. As long as you're seeing the same thing I am.
Yeah.
The importance, the reason I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about the nature of covenant, because the whole purpose for the prophets, especially Ezekiel, is that they served as what is known as covenant enforcers. In other words, when the covenant was entered into at Sinai, you had, as long as Moses was alive, he made sure they kept covenant. Joshua made sure they kept covenant. When the judges came through, they weren't as effective at doing that, and that's why Israel basically gets judged so many times, so harshly. And it's about in the period of the judges that you have the first major judge that comes, or prophet that comes along, that's Samuel. So Samuel is going to work kind of in that prophetic line, and he is a prophet with a small p. And so you're going to have people like Samuel, Nathan, Gad, Elijah, Elisha, all of those non-writing prophets, or a lot of them are non-writing prophets, and then you're going to get up to Ezekiel. And so what they did is they basically indicted the people based upon the covenant that was given at Sinai. And that's why I noted earlier in your quiz the importance of chapters 28 of Deuteronomy and Leviticus 26. That was what's going to happen to them if they break covenant. Like I said, I often tell my students at the very end of the class on the final exam, did you read everything before God and his holy angels and the curses of the law? When you read Deuteronomy chapter 28 and Leviticus 26, you can kind of get a feel for, how harsh they are. And so in that context, because Israel was in covenant with Yahweh, the major question is, what did that covenant look like to Israel? How did they understand it? Was it something like a marriage covenant? Or was it something like a treaty? Or does it have to be either or? We know that according to Leviticus or Ezekiel chapter 16, we are going to see that Ezekiel uses language of a husband and wife. And so he is interpreting it allegorically or metaphorically as a husband-wife language. In other words, in the same way that a husband should be jealous for his wife and vice versa, so is Israel or God or Yahweh jealous for his wife, Israel. Judah, in this case, he uses Jerusalem kind of as the all-encapsulating term for Judah. And so the language, for the most part, reflects both this idea of a marriage, but more importantly, of a Hittite covenant, or the covenants or treaties, where you have stipulations and so forth, where they set up and there's a formal agreement that's entered into. And this is very common because I had you read the vassal treaties of Esarhaddon last week. And so you kind of get a feel for that formality. So we actually see both of those. And so what happens is as a covenant enforcer. This is often, you'll see this in the prophets, and I've given you a list of different places where you actually have these indictments given. And I would never ask you to list these or anything like that. This is more FYI. But you should recognize the fact that there is a lawsuit that can be brought by the prophets against the nation. And what Ezekiel actually does, while he does not necessarily go into a specific lawsuit format, he is actually indicting his people for what they have done. And so the book of Ezekiel overall is an indictment of the people for their sin. And so he is working within that covenant lawsuit format. Are there any questions on that? We good? All right. Let's go to the next slide that just says covenant lawsuit. I want to give you a quick overview of what that looks like. And so probably one of the best ones, best examples of this, it's very short and concise, is Micah 6, verses 1 to 8. Now, this is a little bit before the time of Ezekiel, but if you look at Micah 6, 1 to 8, you get a good feel for this covenant indictment format that is very, very common in the biblical text. And again, this is, when we start reading Ezekiel, you get a feel for why he is using certain language. So, for example, in Micah 6, 1 to 8, the very first thing that he does is they call the people to account, and they call them to listen. So Micah 6:1 says, "Hear now what the Lord is saying." It's kind of like, "Oh yea, oh yea, oh yea, the judge is now in session, all rise." And so what they're doing is they're calling the court into session, and he says, "Arise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice." In other words, he's saying, tell me, please tell me where I have in some way hindered you. And so what they get is the speech of the plaintiff, and there's usually the summons of the heaven and the earth. Now, why would he summon heaven and earth? What's the purpose of the summoning of heaven and earth?
Witnesses.
Excuse me?
Witnesses.
They're witnesses, but why not? Because in the ancient world, they normally would summons the gods, right? In this case, what they're doing, what the prophets do, because they're monotheistic, they call the things that God has created, heavens and earth, that have basically stood and been around for all since the beginning of creation. And so they summons those type of things. And so you have this bringing of witnesses together. They summons the defendant, and they go through this process, and you can see it back and forth, this kind of back and forth discussion that goes on. And he puts the indictment before the people. "Listen, you mountains, to the indictment of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth, because the Lord has a case against his people. Even with Israel, he will dispute." So all the languages of a court sounds very much, well, even though Ezekiel does not do this, what you have is, in fact, this idea of Ezekiel bringing the nation before God and indicting them for their sin. Now, they're like I said, their number one sin is idolatry. There's no question on that. If you want a good example of this, if you want to do, this is also a good paper topic, especially if you can apply it in the role of the pastor or the role of the preacher, evangelist, and what our role is or what their role is in today's terms in light of what perhaps Ezekiel's role was, to call the nation spiritually to a kind of well, for lack of better terms, call them back to God, kind of the great awakenings. And so it's another great paper topic. If you want a good example of this in the New Testament, back about, it's probably been about 4 or 5 years ago, I published an article in the Journal of Evangelical Theological Society. And I actually looked at Acts chapter 7. And Stephen's speech before the council. For so long, scholars struggled and scratched their heads of why this guy is standing there recounting history and basically calling to account the Jews of his day. And my argument was that this is actually, he's marshaling this ancient Israelite prophetic covenant indictment, and he's indicting the people because they rejected Christ. And so he basically announced judgment on them. And from that point forward, of course, well, that's exactly what happens within the Jewish people when they reject Christ. And so if you want to read more on that, and I give you all kinds of footnotes in that particular article. I'm not exactly sure whether it's in the bibliography, but if you want to read more on that, you can just get in touch with me and I can give you more information on that. So if we go to the next slide, the next thing I want to look at quickly, and like I said, I'm just kind of giving you an overview of what covenant is like and the importance of covenant. We also have the idea of corporate versus individual responsibility. Ezekiel deals with this quite a bit within his book. We often get this feel for the idea of corporate personality. This is the language that was often used, where you have the king and he's responsible for all the people. And that was true. In the ancient world, the king was responsible for what went on within the nation. That is why David, for example, is taken to task for his sin with Bathsheba, but also for his leading the nation astray by numbering the people. The very end of his life, well, according to the biblical text in 2 Samuel chapter 24, 1 Chronicles 21, he actually he wants the people numbered, and Joab kind of resists that. And then when David gets his way, God punishes all the people. That's kind of that corporate responsibility that he had. But there is also a concept of individual responsibility. Now, in our culture, and when you're making this application spiritually, we often see each other or view each other through a very individualistic perspective. In other words, everybody's responsible for their own thing. That, for the most part, is very Western in its mindset. We don't. It's kind of, you go back to when Cain is confronted by God and he says, "Where's your brother?" And he says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" We are always our brother's keeper. And Paul talks about this a lot in Romans, especially towards the end in chapter 14. Again, I think in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, where he addresses the whole idea of our responsibility to our brother and our sister. Perhaps in what we eat, perhaps in their entertainment, what we drink, all of those things that can create problems. And so Ezekiel sees the same thing. He sees corporate responsibility. Chapter 17, he is going to call out. In chapter 19, he is going to call out the kings. But you have chapter 18 in between, and we're going to see that is very much rooted in individual responsibility, as is chapter 14, portions of chapter 14. And so he balances these two things, whereas the ancients may have thought, well, it's just the king's fault. Ezekiel said it's not just the king. He is responsible, that is true. But you also have to take into account that you are responsible as an individual. And so they're not going to get out of this thing without themselves taking responsibility for their sin. Let me see. Well, we'll move on from that into the next slide. Are there any questions on that? Again, this is hopefully kind of setting, when we start jumping into the text, which will be in a few minutes, I want you to have all this foundation so we can kind of get an understanding of what's going on. The other thing that you've noted on your quiz and you've read about, was the idea of covenant curses. And so what we are going to see in the book of Ezekiel is an unfolding of covenant curses on the people. These covenant curses are coming out of Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26. You'll see those chapters again. You've already seen them on the quiz. Very important chapters to Ezekiel. The question that has always been, and this will come back to Ed, to your question on the P source and all that stuff and the dating. A lot of this comes out of scholarly debate on whether the curses are actually coming out of Assyrian influence versus Hittite influence much earlier. And so, in other words, when you look at, and it all boils down to how one dates this quote-unquote theoretical P source versus the D source, so to speak, which is influencing which. Now, you have read through some of that, and I apologize for that first chapter. I know it's kind of heavy reading, but hopefully it was enough to get you into kind of the mindset of what scholars are saying about it. But if they go with the Assyrian influence, what they are saying is, well, Ezekiel is drawing upon Deuteronomy because Deuteronomy was only a few years removed from him. Remember, if they're saying Deuteronomy is coming around in 622, was written by some pious scribes, He was born in 623, so he's kind of grown up with this. I think that's very fanciful. I think that based upon the formatting of the book of Deuteronomy, and you've read through that whole argument, I think that it is best placed on the lips of Moses, and I think it fits best within the period of the Hittites. Back in the 14th century, fits perfectly right into that time frame of Moses coming out of Egypt. And so it makes sense that he would formulate it this way. If that is the case, then a lot of those curses that he is giving are, when you start seeing parallels between ancient Assyrian curses, ancient Hittite curses, a lot of it has to do with the fact that there was just a stock list of curses that throughout the centuries they used, because it's an agrarian society. So they would just kind of, okay, if you break this command, the heavens are going to be as bronze. Well, why would they use that stock curse? In other words, in their thinking, in their cosmology, that would mean that God is going to shut the windows of heaven. And all the ancients understood that the gods gave them rain through windows in the heavens. And so it becomes very much a stock curse. And Moses does the exact same thing, and Ezekiel is going to pull this out as well. All right. That is my short spiel on covenant. Are there any questions on that? So you kind of get the understanding of this idea of covenant. We good? All right. I'm going off of Ed and Destry. I can see one with the thumbs up, and all right, let's go. Let's go to the next slide then. And this is Ezekiel's context, and we've talked a little bit about this, so I'm not going to belabor it. When we were talking through Ezekiel's early history, early childhood, and growing up under all of the historical upheaval that was going on between the Assyrians and the Babylonians, when Ezekiel ends up in exile in the 6th century, think of ancient Babylon as New York City. It was kind of the center of culture. What do they call it? The Big Apple. It was the center of everything. And this is where a little, this backwater town or city of Jerusalem, this young guy is being taken from there and plunked into the middle of New York City, the New York City of the ancient world. Now, granted, he was just outside of Babylon, but they're still going to have that influence. They're close enough to have that influence. I can remember the very first time I was in New York City. I don't know whether who all has actually traveled there, but I can remember the first time I was there was in my senior year of my undergrad. And I am from small town New Brunswick, Canada. And I can remember driving a van down the streets of New York City because I was one of the van drivers. And all I could think was being caged in. And everything that was coming at me, the lights and all of the stores and the shops and the things that a man ought not to see. And I just thought, I need to get out of here. It was kind of overwhelming. In this case, that was the exact same thing that I'm sure guys like Ezekiel are dealing with. And that overwhelming nature of especially the imagery and the iconography, I can understand why this becomes part of his visionary experience, of his dreams and so forth, because God is going to use those things to impress upon him a message. And that message is going to be very much rooted in that cultural context of which Ezekiel finds himself. Now, the question is, why would God want to do this? Why would he opt to use this Babylonian imagery? Sometimes, and I really think God has a sense of humor in this regard, God will take the very things that we make our gods, that we make kind of our spiritual life, and he will turn it back on them. And the children of Israel, or the men of Judah and the people of Judah in the exile, some of them actually end up staying in exile even when they can go back at the end of the exile. It is going to be one of those things that they're going to become very comfortable with it. Some are going to say, we're heading back really short period of time. Others are going to settle down, like Jeremiah says in chapter 29, and they're going to settle down and have houses and marry and whatnot. But for the most part, God is going to take those things, that part of their punishment, and now he's going to turn it back on them and use it as part of the kind of the language of judgment and the images. So now they can recognize and see the things around them, and they're making the connections with what God is revealing through his prophet Ezekiel. And so that's kind of the context of which he is now coming into, and I think that's going to reflect some of the language he's going to be using in chapters 1 to 3. Are there any questions of that before we look quickly at the structural aspects, and then we will move on? We good? You would think this is the end of the semester or something. You guys are already tired, right? All right, let's look at the structural suggestions that have been given. There are 5 different, and I've just given you 5. And again, I would not ask you to list all the specific structural parts per se, of each of these. But I would want you to be familiar with the fact that there is a variety of the different structures. The most common one is what is known as the 3-part structure. The 3-part structure, as you can see, is chapters 1 to 24, 25 to 32, and 33 to 48. That's kind of the common. I propose the 3-part structure slightly differently if I'm going to break it down. And I do this as you start reading through. I probably caught some of this as you were reading through this week. But I argue that chapters 1 to 12 form kind of an inclusio, a bookend, an enveloping, because you actually have language, especially in chapters 3 and 12, very similar, the rebellious house language. So I think that is one block, and then it goes into kind of all the indictments, chapters 13 to 24, and then finally chapters 25 to 48 are kind of the messages of hope. Some have argued for a 4-part structure. Some have argued for a 5-part structure. You can kind of get a feel for it. They're kind of all over the map here, and that's why I do not, get too hung up on all the different structures. I think that there is a pretty clear division, however, based upon, in number 5, upon the visionary aspect. Now you'll notice I skipped over the chronological. I actually have a handout that I think you have access to. Did anybody actually print that out or get, so they have it in front of them?
I have a print, but I have a...
Yeah, that's what it looks like. I find that very helpful. It's actually I uploaded it to your resources. I think it's there. So you can always just look at it electronically. But that one, the reason I say the chronological, those are the ones where you actually have, where you have the specifically dated time periods when certain visions or prophecies came to Ezekiel. And so some scholars argue that you can organize it structurally based upon those. The only problem with that is not all of them are dated. And so we have, for the most part, there are a number of them that are dated there, but there are some that are out of chronological order as well. There's some that are placed out. At least one is out of order. And so these 13 date notations are often seen as as a way of structuring it. Again, the one that I prefer is the visionary, because I think that when you look at the structure from a visionary perspective, you kind of get a feel for it. Now, Len, you'll see that the next 2 slides are actually just that handout. So we're not going to read through that. That is, I'm assuming that you're going to have that chronology on a handout. That's why all that fine print is there. Yes?
On number 1, you proposed 1 through 12, and what did you say about them? 1 through 12 was what you proposed?
Why do I say that? Because...
But I missed the word that you said that summarized 1 through 12. When you're
it's because it forms. It's a technical term called an inclusio. It's just called, another term is enveloping. When you envelop something and you put, you kind of slide something in between the 2 sides of the envelope. Inclusio, I-N-C-L-U-S-I-O. It is just a technical term that scholars use to point out that usually you have language at the beginning and the end of something, and that shows you that that's kind of to be read in as a block. And so you have a concentration of the language of unfaithful or a rebellious house, sorry. That's kind of at the beginning, at the end of that block. We'll also see that these, by the end of chapter 12, that's where the exile is promised. And as soon as the exile is promised, that is when all hell breaks loose and the judgments and indictments come in chapters 13 to 24. Does that make sense? All right. So yeah, you can skip over those two chronological parts. Now, I'm going to step out here on a limb for a second. And if you pull up Ezekiel's message to his audience, and it should read, most of you may know more about Ezekiel than you and his rhetorical intent than you actually realize. Now, if you've done your reading, you've probably already seen my little chart. Now, I don't know how closely you read that, but normally what I would do with my students is I ask them to, kind of tell me what you know about the book of Ezekiel. And so without looking at it, without looking at it, from your memory of what you've already kind of read from Ezekiel and kind of processed, what things do you see as being standing out? And I'm going to walk over to the other board, and I actually want to write this on the board for you. So you can kind of see, you are actually going to fill out my chart for me. All right. So I ask you, can you tell me anything that you know from the book of Ezekiel?
Ezekiel saw a wheel way up in the middle of the air.
Okay, a wheel within a wheel, yes? All right, I'm going to draw here. Basically, this is what's in the book. And I think that you can see this, yes?
Yeah.
Yep.
Did I just go past where you can't see?
Okay, there you go.
Okay, we got it?
Okay, we've got God calls the prophet. I believe that's the first one.
Speak right into the mic.
I believe the first one is God calls the prophet.
Okay, so we'll put the wheel within the wheel. This is vision 1. We have the wheel within the wheel. That also is going to appear over here in vision 2. That's chapters 8 through 11. This one is chapters 1 to 3. So we have vision 1, vision 2. Now you say the call of the prophet. The call of the prophet falls right in here. So we have the call. Call of Ezekiel. What else do you know?
Vision 2 is the abandonment of the temple, right?
The what of the temple?
The abandonment.
The abandonment of the temple. All right, so that's over here. That's vision 4. That's the temple vision. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, the temple vision, that's going to be chapters 40 to 48. What else?
Well, the dry bones coming to life.
The Valley of Dry Bones, right? That is going to be vision 3. The Valley of Dry Bones. That's going to be Ezekiel 37, 1 to 14.
What about the 2 sticks? 2 sticks going together.
The 2 what?
2 sticks.
The 2 sticks. Yeah, that's actually part of, the 2 sticks are part of, it's actually an interpretation or coming out of this. It's in 37:15 forward and following is actually going to pick up that idea of the 2 sticks.
Ezekiel is mute, and then he's eating, tied up and laid on his side, and
Okay, Synax, all the Synax, right?
yeah.
All the Synax appear right in here, chapters 4 and 4 to 6. These are the Synax. You're almost there. Anything else?
His wife died.
Excuse me?
His wife died.
His wife died.
Oh, his wife died. Yes, sorry. Chapter 24. Death of his wife. You're missing a couple right in here.
the immoral, isn't that the immoral wife or unfaithful wife?
The unfaithful wife imagery, right? That is the key to what's going on here in chapter 24. You know, the death of the wife. 16 and 23 are two extended metaphors.
Oh, yeah.
Two extended metaphors. Now, why do I do that? The reason I do this with students is to show you that you naturally, here you are in the 21st century, and what you do naturally is go to those things that are visionary. You remember those things. Now, you know, you got the sign acts. Those are very much something that you would, you know, kind of visualize. There's the sign act of the death of his wife, the sign acts of laying on the side, eating certain types of breads and whatnot, and food. Then you have, but you picked out the visions, vision 1, vision 2, vision 3, and vision 4. And I think that maybe if we go back on that last slide, I might have said the 5 visions. That should be 4 visions, if I recall. No, just number 5 visionary, sorry. When you look at that, if you pull up the next slide, you'll actually now have that, you should be able to see kind of it more fleshed out what we just did on the board. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so here when I did this for my dissertation, and I had put together this whole argument, that wasn't originally a part of it. And one of the complaints of one of the readers was, he said, you should do a drawing to explain it to people. And in that one drawing, what you have is my entire book. And at the same time, it's the entire book of what Ezekiel is doing. In that whole process of the switching or the judgments of the visions. My basic argument was, and this is where again I think the structure is key, is that if you in the 21st century can point out and go immediately to those visions, is Ezekiel doing the same thing to draw in his audience? He's using visualize things that they're going to very much stimulate their thinking process, and it'll be in their memory. And I think that's why he's using this type of language. And what he does is he hangs his entire message on these visions and builds around these visions. And so when you kind of get that overall structure of Ezekiel, I think you understand the book a lot better. Instead of just a bunch of disjointed messages, what you have is a very highly structured book. I think of all of the prophetic books, and I've looked at and I've taught the prophets before, of all the prophetic books, especially the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and you could even include Daniel. I think that Ezekiel is the most structured book of all of them. It has, you know, the way that it is set up pulls the author in or pulls the reader in very quickly into what he's trying to do. All right, let's just move to the next slide. And are there any questions on that drawing? Do you understand what I'm? Like I said, I don't want to belabor it. I want to get into the text. But if you do have questions, now is the time.
I like the visual.
Yes.
Yes, visual.
What's that?
The visual is helpful.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, once you get that kind of that idea in your head, that's what I'm going to be describing for the rest of the class throughout the semester. That's what for the good portion of the semester. We're going to work through that visual. Well, if you move to the next one, the theological message. Now let's ask the question: why is Ezekiel writing what he's writing? We're going to start reading the book, but what is his purpose? Why sit down and write 48 chapters? Scholars say, well, he didn't write it. This is just a bunch of different, probably some of his students later writing that stuff down, putting it together, all of these Palestinian revisions and so forth. And my argument is, as I touched on last week, I said this does not make sense in the context, because when you start looking at that drawing that I did, it balances out perfectly. You have 2 visions of hope, 2 visions of judgment. You have the extended metaphors. These are the longest metaphors in the entire Bible. And they say almost the exact same thing. Why would he do that? And so everything is kind of pivoting here, and then it balances right on chapter 24 and goes into visions of hope. Well, his theological message, when you stop and look at this, his overall message obviously is theological. He is trying to get across something very clearly to the people, something that they have lost sight of. And this will preach all day long. And that is they've lost the sense of the holiness of who God is. And so if you pull up that theological message, I don't know whether you have that PowerPoint up. Yes, we got it. Good. The holiness of God. It is one of those, and I heard my pastor just preach on this a couple of weeks ago. People have lost that sense of the holiness of who God is. And along with that comes a holy awe. One of the number one things in spiritual formation, you can do all of the fasting and the praying and whatever until the cats come home. But if you have lost a sense of who you're actually praying to and what the importance of your actions are, and the fact that this is because we stand in the presence of a holy God, then it's meaningless. And Israel had gone through, and Judah had gone through all of the process of, the fasts, the feasts, the sacrifices, and here they are in exile. And Ezekiel is trying to tell them, and this goes back even when you read the book of Micah, and I just touched on that in chapter 6, but he goes on to say, the people come to Micah and they say, what shall we offer for our sins? Shall we offer 10,000 rams and rivers of oil, our firstborn children, shall we do that? And he said, you're missing the point. He has told you, O man, what is good and what is right, and that is to love justice, to love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. In other words, respect the holiness of who God is. And when you respect the holiness of God, it's going to reflect your character in your character. And so Ezekiel is now going to give them a re-education process. And that is why consistently, 63 times in the book of Ezekiel, you have this phrase, then they or then you will know that I am Yahweh. It is the most repeated phrase in the entire book. Another great paper topic. This is the whole idea of what is called the recognition formula. That's another name for this. It's recognizing who God is. They had failed to recognize the holiness of God, and so he says, fine, you don't get it? He says, you're going to end up in exile. You're in exile as it is now. He said, now you're going to find out why you're in exile. And I'm going to re-educate you so you will kind of get a feel for the importance of recognizing the holiness of God. I know that this would never happen in your class. And so I will speak about the other class that meets in that room before you. But I know that this is the case even where I teach. And that is when I can walk into a room of freshman students, and I'm at a Christian university, and I know that 85% of these students are coming from a Christian, quote-unquote, Christian home or background. But yet I walk into that classroom, and I know that there is lying, stealing, cheating, sleeping around, and it's over 50+% of my students. I know the stats because they do anonymous surveys. And I'm thinking, how is this possible? How is it possible that you grow up in a context of the church and of knowing who God is, or at least being taught about God, and yet your life doesn't reflect it? And you declare yourself to be Christian. And at the bottom, or at the heart of this, is the fact that there is not a change of concept of the holiness of God. They have not had that perspective taught to them. And now, whether it's their fault or whether it's our church's fault, some of you will be in ministry. Some of you probably already are in ministry of some sort. I can't stress enough, when if you're looking at this material and you want to spiritually form other people, stress the holiness of God. Because once people get a grasp of the holiness of God and who he is, a lot of this other stuff will flow out of it. In other words, it will naturally take care of itself. You're not going to want to do X, Y, or Z. And again, I'm not preaching to you. It's for the other classes. And so, but for the students that you may come in contact with someday and be teaching. And so they're going to have a re-education process. They're going to find out what the gravity of their sin actually is. They're going to realize why they're in exile, but it's not just because, hey, we're the innocent ones. We got here. We don't really deserve it. He's actually going to tell them, look, you don't understand. We're here in exile, but there is impending doom coming on the nation from which we just came from, in Judah. And so that opening chapter of Ezekiel is going to just explode with imagery reflecting this very thing. And he's basically going to teach, like Jeremiah, he's going to say that the exile is going to be long, folks. We are not innocent. We have lost this understanding of the holiness of God. And when you finally, when all of this finally happens, then you will know that I am Yahweh, will be your cry, will be the cry of Yahweh. Are there any questions on that? We good? All right. I have here some summary and conclusion on the next couple slides. Kind of from the perspective of, this is coming right out of the textbook, so I don't want to spend too much time, but I'll just quickly read over to kind of give you a feel for what I think is Ezekiel's, kind of the setting for what he's trying to get as he begins his book. Based upon what we have read thus far, we may conclude then that Ezekiel was indeed a prophet of the exile who had ample opportunity to avail himself of Mesopotamian literature. Based upon our chapter 1, he could avail himself of literature, art, and culture in general. The symbolism and the imagery so radically different throughout his message is best attributed to his setting in Babylon. And again, that's what we're going to see as we move forward. These peculiarities have made Ezekiel a transitional prophet between the classical prophets of the pre-exilic era and the visionaries of the post-exilic era. When you go into, and I'm not sure how much time we're going to have as the semester progresses, but if we do have time, I spend maybe an hour or so looking at Ezekiel's connections to the apocalyptic literature. But one of the number one books quoted from in the apocalyptic literature is Ezekiel, and a lot of it has to do with the kind of how pregnant this imagery is and how much meaning it has. So that's what's made him very unique, and a lot of scholars have seen him as a transitional prophet between these two time periods. Moreover, his message presupposes a pre-existent law code of some form, and so in other words, as you've read, he is indicting them based upon some type of a law code. I think that's the Sinai covenant. I think it's from the book of Deuteronomy. And I also think it's from Leviticus. Moreover, moreover, his message presupposes a pre-existent law code of some form and the covenantal relationship of Israel with her suzerain. Do you know what I mean when I say a suzerain? Did you pick that up in your reading?
Master.
Lord.
What's that?
Lord, master, ruler.
Yeah, it's actually a term that was used in the ancient world. It is the overlord, kind of somebody who is over, and a suzerain could be a king, a ruler. It could be, the mayor of the town, so to speak. But generally speaking, it was usually a ruler of an empire. And of course, for Israel, the suzerain is going to be Yahweh. And so they're using this type of language. And again, whether he sees it as husband and wife language, overall, I think it has a lot to do with this idea of suzerain vassal language. Ezekiel's knowledge of the covenant curses found in the law codes of the Old Testament and the ancient Near Eastern treaties, especially those in the late Iron Age, allowed for a ready pool of punishments appropriate to the indictments he would set forth from the instructions of Yahweh. The stage is now set for the unfolding of what would be perhaps the most vivid presentation of symbolism and covenant curses that Israel had seen or heard to date. The last slide before we move on. Indeed, Yahweh was their king and suzerain against whom they had rebelled. The message of Ezekiel would make that clear once and for all. It is perhaps for this reason that Ezekiel's own words are best applied as we move forward to the unpacking of the message of the prophet. And I'm quoting here from Ezekiel 20. And that which comes into your mind, surely it will not come to pass, when you are saying, we will be like the nations, like the tribes of the land, serving wood and stone. As I live, declares the Lord God, with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm and with wrath poured out, I will be king over you. In other words, there is no question in the mind of the reader who is actually going to have the final say here. Ezekiel is going to have or Yahweh through the prophet Ezekiel will have the final say. All right. Are there any questions?
I have one.
Yes.
Is it true that the prophets, that the nation actually heeded the prophet's message and turned from their idol worship after the exile?
Yes, that is often been argued that there's one thing that the exile did very well, and that was it ridded Israel or Judah, however you want to look at the people of God, of their idolatry. When they come back, for the most part, they are not going to be, now it's not going to be 100%, that's for sure, but for all intents and purposes, they are going to have kind of got the picture that this is something that we cannot do ever again. And when you read Ezra and Nehemiah, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which are post-exilic, you will get this idea, even in the intermarriage between the foreign nations and the peoples, they bring that up on a very short leash very quickly because they recognize that if we do this, it can lead us astray. Because that's where it started. It started with being kind of unequally yoked together and then going after other gods and going after the gods of the nations because of intermarriage. This goes back all the way to the book of Judges. And so I think what's going on here is the exile while it ridded them of their desire for idols, there was something else that became an idol to them. Does anybody know what that was? Christ is going to deal with this in his time period. There's something that happens between about 500 down to the period of Christ in the first century. Something else becomes an idol to them.
The law?
The law.
The law.
They worship the law.
They still worship the law.
And they still worship it, yeah. In other words, what they are doing is they have placed, and Christ is combating this constantly. That's why he's challenging all of their oral tradition and their interpretation of it. Because they are people of the book, there's no question. But as Christ says, your heart is far from me. And again, spiritually speaking, this will preach all day long. You can know the Bible inside out. That was me from the time I was a teenager until I was what I classify truly got my life turned around in my early 20s. I knew the Bible inside out. I could quote it backwards and frontwards, and people would start a verse, I could finish it, and I prided myself in that. But that didn't do it. Pride, exactly. And so there's something to be said for understanding. What's that?
We're not guilty.
Not us.
Not us. Of course not. Well, I'm glad I'm on this side of the country, so when lightning strikes over there, I'm not going to get toasted. All right. Well, on that happy note, all right. Where were we? Any other questions? All right, then let's move to chapter 1. And I think on this next slide, you actually have what is called the indictment. It should be. And I just want to quickly go over that. And then hopefully you have your Bibles with you tonight. Because the way I do this normally is I take my Bible and I just open it up and I begin reading. And if you have any questions, and I'll try to unpack it as we go, that's kind of how we'll move forward. And so pretty much from this point on, that's the way I'll be working as soon as I set kind of a little bit of the tone here for chapter 1. So what we're going to see in chapter 1 is the beginning of Ezekiel's indictment of the people. Again, this is very much covenant lawsuit language. And so the main reason for Yahweh's judgment seems to be related to the nation's involvement in idolatry. I've noted this. And so you can see, I've given you a number of chapters where this concept of idolatry, it takes center stage and where he calls it out continually. Now, again, in our context, idolatry we may not worship the way they did, but we have definitely our idols that we set up. Ezekiel will move from the general overview of sins in chapters 4 to 7 to specific sins in chapters 8 forward and following. And so that's why what we're going to do in these first 11, 12 chapters, we're going to see these two visions really dominate this first 11 chapters. You have chapters 1 to 3, chapters 8 to 11, and then in between we have chapters 4 to 7. Well, what chapters 4 to 7 are going to do is they're just going to give you kind of an overview of all of these sins. Then that overview, from that, Ezekiel's going to jump off of that from chapters 13 to 24, and he's going to start unpacking all of those sins, and he's going to go in great detail. So he's just kind of giving this overview in between these two visions. Hopefully that, that makes sense in this context. So let's look at the very first peek. I have vision 1, the next slide. You will actually see, I think you can see it over my, I guess I haven't changed my slide up on there, but I've got it up here in front of me. So you should have in front of you the first peek, yes? The first vision is the decisive part of the book. I think that it's like any other book. Anybody who's ever watched a good movie, you know that how that first scene starts is whether it's going to catch your attention and hold your attention. Anybody ever watched the movie Saving Private Ryan?
Mhm.
If you've ever watched that movie, that opening scene sets the tone for the book, and it just puts you on edge for basically the rest of the movie. Well, what's going to happen here in this very first peek, what I call the first peek of the visions, or the vision, what you are going to see is the tone is set. And now I'm assuming you got a chance to read over chapters 1 to 3? Yes? Chapter 1? Have you read over chapter 1?
Yes.
Okay. If not, we're going to read it together. But there's one of the things that you're going to notice. There's a tone that is set here in chapter 1. And we've talked about this a bit in our earlier classes. And I talked about, why is Ezekiel seems to be so either jaded or upset with what's going on. It's because he has lived through all of that carnage. He has lived through the fact, here's a priest, he's now in exile, and his opening tone is going to be very negative. It reveals Yahweh's holiness and his anger with the people. So we're going to see in chapter 1 that unpacking there as well. And aspects of the vision will be repeated 2 more times, and I've noted it in chapters 8 to 11 and again in chapter 43. And so, no further ado, what I would like to do is I'm going to start reading. We're going to come back to the next slide in a minute. But what I would like to do is, let's see, how are we doing for time? 8:41. Well, on second thought, we're just about coming up on our break, aren't we? And so I'll tell you what, if you pull up the next slide and you get the theology of the vision, I'll spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about this, and then we will take our break, and then we will come back and we will start reading chapter 1. And as we start reading through chapter 1, I will start unpacking it and give you some commentary on what I think is going on and how to apply it. And so if you look at the theology of the vision that he is going to see, we know that the tone is going to be harsh. We know that it's showing that Yahweh, the suzerain of Israel, is upset. But there's something else that's being taught here very, very clearly. And that is God is not restricted by borders. We talked about this, I believe, in a previous class, Psalm 137, that God can actually call someone in a foreign land. Israel was in trouble with their suzerain, there's no question, and he is going to show them what it is that they did to make God so upset, their suzerain so upset. The temple may be destroyed, but Yahweh would be their sanctuary for a little while or in exile. And the language there is actually in 11:16, very important, because this is where we already are going to start seeing parallels to the Gospel of John, of which we were going to talk about towards the end of the semester. But in Ezekiel, that portion of chapter 11, verse 16, he makes an interesting statement there that is would really fly in the face of their own thinking of how the gods work. Because remember, the gods, they were thinking that they're very much localized. And in verse 16 of chapter 11, it says, Therefore say, thus says the Lord, though I had removed them far away among the nations, and though I had scattered them among the countries, yet I was a sanctuary for them a little while in the countries where they had gone. In other words, they don't have a temple. They don't have the ability to worship God, or at least like Psalm 137, that concept of not being able to worship God. But he's trying to tell them that wherever they are, he is going to be there in their midst, and they can worship him. It's kind of that beginning of the idea of worshiping him in spirit and in truth. Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 4 in particular, he notes this when Jeremiah says, do not say, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. God is not bound by four walls. You do not need a temple to worship God. You need to worship him in spirit and in truth. And that's done, and of course, John chapter 4 picks up this very idea, where Jesus is with the woman at the well, and they have this debate about Jacob's well. They have this debate about where the temple is. And Christ says to him, you don't understand. Once again, you must worship in spirit and in truth. God is not bound by four walls. And this is the part of the theology and the re-education process that Israel is going to go through. All right.
What was it, Jeremiah, that you said that?
Jeremiah chapter 7, I believe. Jeremiah 7, verse 4. Let me just double check that. Yeah. Jeremiah 7, verse 4, he is addressing the people. He's standing on the temple, at the Temple Mount, on the stairs of the temple, and he says in verse 3, thus says the Lord God, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your deeds, and I will let you dwell in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words, saying, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. In other words, the thinking was, we have God in a box. He's here with us. That's all we need. Ezekiel and Jeremiah both are going to call that into question. And what we're going to see after the break, we'll start reading in chapter 1. And I think that this will start becoming very clear of what he's trying to get across to the people. All right. Let's take a 15-minute break. Can we do that? We will reconvene at about 9 o'clock or just before, or sorry, your time, 8 o'clock. And my students, if you can give a good reason why you wrote something or answered a certain way, if you can explain it. All right.
Dr. Stripling says that too, and since you're his friend, I encouraged her to ask.
There you go. Is he showing you in the book where it is?
Right, but can I read it?
Oh, okay.
Okay.
This wasn't my intention.
Uh-oh, you're not going to use my own words against me.
No.
So honestly, like I remember this part, but because of the way that it was worded, it didn't bring up this part to me. He says, or you say, in the first 24 chapters are focused on judgment. The last 24 chapters present a picture of curse reversal. It is to the structure we now turn.
What page are you on?
91.
91.
91. Wow, you're using my book against me.
I need those 10 points. If I or even need my other answers, I would.
So curse reversal isn't necessarily hope.
Yeah, in that case, yeah, what I'm talking about there is the curse reversal is, yeah, I was trying to get across the point that is obviously hopeful for Israel because it's undoing everything that was against them. But, yeah, if that's not clear, I have no problem giving you that.
Thank you.
All right.
You're the best.
Thank you so much.
But on the final exam, we need to know what you mean since you spent.
Well, hopefully by the midterm and the final, you're starting to get a picture of what I'm trying to get across based upon the instruction in the class, because you're only going to be tested on what we covered. And so the difference between an exam and a quiz is the quizzes are what you've been reading, just to kind of see where you're at, to keep you honest that you're reading. All right. I've been interacting with you some by email about your papers, and I was just reading another one. I want you to, I think it was Shannon's that you just sent me one.
Yes.
Okay. I don't care which one of which for all of you from that list, you can choose. What I'm most concerned about is that you don't bite off more than you can chew. In other words, this is why, and I'm not sure how you all do that, write your papers at the seminary there, but think about you need to have a thesis statement where, and this is the way I do it easily for my students. I say, it's like this: in this paper, I will X. That is a thesis statement. Or in this paper, I will prove X. And it's usually within one line. If you start moving into an entire paragraph to describe your thesis statement, then it's probably too cumbersome. And so I try to get my students to think from that perspective where they just say, keep it as simple as possible, even though you may obviously flesh that out in your paper. But if you have to summarize this down to one statement, what would it be? In this paper, I am going to prove that chapter 1 is very much a reflection of, whatever. The other thing that you do after that, you do what we call methodology. And so you're going to say, in this paper, I will do X. I will prove this by looking at A, the ancient Near East context, B, Ezekiel's use of this phrase, D, that type of thing, where you're giving like 2 or 3 of the things that you are going to do in the paper. That's kind of your method of how you're going to prove your thesis. And that's really gives you your outline for your paper. And I should be able to see that in your first couple paragraphs. A good paper is going to state right up front what you're attempting to do and what your conclusion is going to be. I shouldn't read all the way through your paper still trying to figure out what your thesis is and what your conclusion is going to be. I should know up front what your conclusion is going to be, so that way I can trace with you and see if you're doing what you say you're going to do. Does that make sense? All right. Ezekiel chapter 1.
Oh, we have a paper due next week, right?
I think that there is a paper. I don't have my schedule right in front of me, but I think that there is a spiritual formation paper, yes?
Yes.
That's just like a 300-word paper, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's just a short. So what I'm wanting you to do is to choose one from each of those 3 categories from Richard Davidson's book, Richard Foster Story's book, this one. So you're just picking one, and it doesn't have to be in any particular order as long as you get one from each one. And you're just choosing something, and that's why I encourage you at this point to maybe be reading a little bit through the book of Ezekiel. I guess my assumption was most people come in having read or skimmed through the book of Ezekiel. But this way you can start thinking about, for example, fasting. And Ezekiel has a special diet that he goes through. And why does he do that? How does it apply? Why is that important to his spiritual disciplines? That type of thing. Questions?
Did you say on those you want us to link it to the specific chapters of Ezekiel that we're reading for the week?
No, he said that we could mix and match.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember how I worded this. I don't want to,
What order you said that we could pick the spiritual formation from, which of them, the 3 categories or whatever, and apply it.
Yeah, it should be some way applied to the biblical text that we're dealing with.
Yeah, but you want it, like for the paper due next week, you want us to look at Ezekiel 1 through 3 and then pick one of the spiritual disciplines?
No, it can be from any place in Ezekiel.
Okay, that's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just looking up here. September 20th is the first paper. You can choose anything, anywhere from the book of Ezekiel on that topic that's related to yours. And you may see it in a couple different places, and you could draw those in. You've only got 300 words. That's like 1 page. And so this is where you have to be very concise and punchy with what you're doing. Stating up front, this is in your heading can be, the spiritual discipline, which one you're doing, show where it is in the book and then how that applies. and how we use it, how it's important to Ezekiel and use it today. I think I give you some instruction there in fleshing that out in the syllabus. While we are on the topic of homework and whatnot, I think you probably should read on now to pages, 97 to about 140, so about 40 pages in the textbook.
Yep.
I think that may be on the schedule already, but it's about 40 pages, and that will take us up to almost the beginning of chapter 8, I think it is. So we'll be starting to work through the material, through the book, fairly, I wouldn't say quickly, but we're going to be going through it at a pretty good pace. So yeah, for next week, pages 97 to 140, Ezekiel 1 to 3. All right. We good? Then let's begin Ezekiel chapter 1. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book. Like I said, the way I do this, I just start reading. We're going to talk through it, and I'll ask you questions, and at any point you have questions, you can flag me down. And it's not going to take very long for me to stop, because now it came about in the 30th year on the 5th day of the 4th month, while I was by the river Chebar, among the exiles, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. What does it mean for his 30th year? This has been a major debate within scholarship. Even in this very first line, I often tell students, they say, I need a paper to write on, a paper topic to write on. I said, open the Bible, stick your finger on any verse, and you probably find a lot of debate from scholars. And so I think that you have on your PowerPoint under chapter 1, if you want to pull it up, it says some of the interpretations or meanings of what chapter 1 in the 30th year actually means. Here are the different ones. Origen, all the way back, the early church, he argued, well, this has to do with his age, that it's in his 30th year. Some people argue this is from the time of the Assyrian exile, and so this is kind of a metaphor, or it's not to be taken literally. I do not like this one in particular, because it doesn't seem even historically to fit. So we can kind of skip over that. These are just some of the ones that have been given. From the period of Josiah's reform, this one I can understand, in the 30th year. So this takes us down to about 593. So this is the beginning of his first dated prophecy. I think you can see that on that handout on the chronology, that the very first one, his ministry is going to start in 593. And it's going to end in 571. And so some people argue, well, it has to do with the reforms. It's been 30 years since the reform started. Another way of looking at it is from the reign of Manasseh, that the end of the reign of Manasseh down to, and again, this time-wise doesn't really fit well, because that would take us down to about 610. Some see it as the 30th year of Jehoiachin's captivity. That would mean it would be down into the 560s. Again, that doesn't really connect. Some people just argue, well, this is just a textual error. It should be the 3rd year after some of the revolts that were taking place in Babylon. And so you can kind of see what scholars have been doing and trying to figure out what this 30th year. I think the easiest one is the obvious one. The best one, I should say, is the obvious one, and that's number 1. I think that what is going on here in his 30th year is that this has to do with the age in which a priest became active in the temple. Now, I know according to the chronicler and according to earlier time periods in the period of Leviticus and whatnot, these ages changed. Originally, it was 25. That some men worked from 25 to in their 50s, and then it later changed to 30. Some of this had to do with the availability of the Levites. If there were a lot of them, then they probably raised the age. It's because they didn't need as many. If they needed more, they would lower the draft age, so to speak, and in this case, go down to 25. And so apparently at this particular time period, the age for a priest coming into full service was the 30th year. And so what this is doing is it's saying that Ezekiel is being called, instead of being a prophet or a priest, he's going to be called to be a prophet. And so his whole calling has changed, or his whole vocation has changed. I mean, I can relate to this, and I noted this the very first night when I was given an introduction of who I was. To have your vocation actually changed, because I was perfectly fine being a Sunday school teacher and being a carpenter and supporting the church. But God changed that whole process. And when I was just on my way, my business was established, everything was booming, and I was going to be retired at 55. And then God at 30 years old, 28, 29, 30 says, oh, by the way, I want you to give up carpentry. I want you to start schooling. I said, are you crazy? No, I didn't literally say that to him, but that's what I'm thinking. And so I can understand. I mean, this is being sensitive to the call of God and the fact that God can change things, and our history may, or our future may not be what we had planned. As Proverbs says, an individual makes his plans for the future, but God directs them. In other words, he's going to tell you ultimately which ones you're taking. And so right here at the very beginning, we have the fact that he is calling, he is pointing out the fact that, and again, you can almost sense the tone here. He's probably not that happy with the fact, here's my 30th year when I should be starting to be a priest, and here I am in exile. And so he gives another date on the 5th day of the 4th month, so very precise. And then he goes on in verse 2, on the 5th of the month of the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's exile. So in this case, it is very precise. We know that they went in exile about 597. Do you remember the dates of your 3 exiles? 604, 597, 586. You will see them again someday. And so in the 5th year of the exile, that would take it from 97, 96, 95, 94, 93. 593 is where he's at. And so that's where we get that date of 593. The word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel, the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar, and there the hand of the Lord came upon me. First, to begin with, within just a few words of this opening chapter, he's already said, the heavens were open and I saw visions of the Lord. So he's given that introduction. He is making no formal introductions here. He is just jumping right in. He goes on and he says that this is that he's the son of Buzi, but other than that, he's given his location, his name, and now let's have the vision. And so he is. There's an urgency, I guess, is what I'm saying. And again, if anything, in the spiritual realm, and when you're looking at the whole concept of spiritual formation and the importance of Bible study and prayer and all those things, there's also the part of recognizing the urgency of not only the hour, but the urgency of what God has called you to do. And in this case, he is very, very much in that context of being urgent. He jumps right into it. And in that opening verse where he says, the heavens were open and I saw visions, the whole idea, and you'll see this when you get into the second textbook on John's use of Ezekiel, that language is very similar to what we see in John chapter 1. And I looked, and behold, and he says to Nathanael, you greater things than these you will see, in the sense of the fact that the Son of Man has been revealed. He said, you will see the heavens opened, and you will see angels ascending and descending. Now, of course, this is a reflection of Genesis chapter 28 with Jacob and his ladder, but it also smacks of the language here of Ezekiel chapter 1, of the revelation of who God is. And so verse 4, he says, as I looked, behold, a storm wind was coming from the north, a great cloud with fire flashing forth continually, and a bright light around it. and in its midst something like a glowing metal in the midst of the fire. What do you think the tone is? It doesn't sound good already. I mean, he is not dancing around this at all. He is jumping right into it. Now, the thing that I want to look at is this idea of the fact that the storm wind was coming from the north. That is a very important statement right there. What you are going to see, if you do it if you had pulled up a Thompson chain or pulled up any type of electronic Bible resource or app, and you punch in, do a search of Ezekiel and put in north, every time that term comes up in the book of Ezekiel, it never has a good connotation. And what I'll do is I want to step over to the other board, and I want to point out or give you a little bit of instruction on why the north is so important in this particular context, why that one little notation is important. Just wait, I got to get an eraser. All right, can you see me over here now?
Yes.
Okay, good. I know I've got a little bit of an echo. I think my other computer's picking it up even though I've got it on mute.
We don't hear an echo.
We don't hear an echo. We don't hear
Okay, I got a little bit, but what's that?
We were making echo noises. I'm sorry, it's late.
Oh, yeah, thank you. All right. Now, I know that some of you, okay, other than Destry, is anybody, and I may have asked this question, how many have actually been in Israel? Okay, so, there's a good number of us have already been there, so sorry, ladies, other than Destry, bear with us, but I'll give you a little bit of instruction on the north here. Here is the spur on which the temple is situated. And matter of fact, in the period of the exile, what you would have had is what is called the Western Hill, and this is the city of David. City of David, can't even spell. So we have the city of David, it's on this spur, and what they did is they actually expanded this out around as well, and the city kept enlarging. But this, for the most part, is the region that was very important. It had obviously all the government structure. It was the Temple Mount. So you have the temple up here. So this was a very important portion of the city of Jerusalem. Any time in the biblical text where, and from history, what we've understood of the attacks on Jerusalem, they have always come from the north. This is north, south, east, and west. So they never attacked from the east. Why don't they attack from the east or the south? Anybody know?
A wall?
They have walls, but what else is there? Do you recall?
Valleys.
The Kidron and the Hinnom, right? You have two valleys. And even today, when you walk up to Jerusalem, even though those valleys, for the most part, have been mostly filled in, you still get quite a feel for the fact that that's quite up to the walls. That would be very formidable to try to get up to. And so, in other words, what they did, what the armies would do, there's a plateau up here on this portion on the north part of the city. They would breach these outside smaller walls, and then they would come up and they would batter the walls on the north end. And in every one, whether you go back to the period of Pompey, when he conquered Jerusalem in 63, when you go back to Titus in 70 AD, when you go back to Nebuchadnezzar, these guys all breached the walls on the north. Matter of fact, when you read the book of Jeremiah, it actually talks about them breaching the walls of I think it's at the Benjamin Gate, and that the king and his sons escaped through an exit in the wall out south, and they head down towards the Dead Sea. Of course, they're going to be caught. But when the Israelites hear, or the Jewish people hear anything about something coming out of the north, this is what they're thinking. It's not going to end well. Now, you may say, well, Brian, where are you getting this? Or Dr. Peterson, where are you getting this? Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah deals with this very thing. What does Jeremiah say is tilted from the north to the south? Does anybody know? There's a boiling pot tilted from the north to the south, and it's going to scald and burn and destroy. In other words, Jeremiah sees the very same thing. Now, why is it constantly from the north? Even the Egyptians, when they would attack, they would come up around and they would attack the north side because it was the easiest way to set up their battering rams. That is why during the period of Herod, he actually built the Antonia fortress on the northern approaches to the city because it was the weakest point. And of course, it didn't do much good anyway because that's where Titus breached the walls. But at the end of the day, when the Israelites would have read or heard anything coming from the north, this would have already aroused suspicion. That's why you have foreboding already here within the first few verses. One of the other things that we note is consistently within the Hebrew Bible, whenever Israel asked for help from God, where does he come from? What direction do they summon Yahweh from? Do you recall?
North.
What's that?
East? The east?
From the south. From Mount Teman, from Mount Sinai, from Mount Horeb, out of the south, Yahweh will come and defend his people. There's only one time in the book of Isaiah that it mentions something about his abode being on Mount Zaphon, which is kind of the mountain of the north. In ancient Ugarit, the Ugaritic, the people who lived in Ugarit, which is in northern Syria on the Mediterranean coast, it was a city-state that was was contemporary with the period of Israel. And this is where we get the idea of Baal worship and whatnot. That was their god, Baal and Anat and El and all of those deities. Well, they actually believed that their god, El, lived on Mount Saphon, which is basically a variation of the Hebrew word Saphon, which means north. So on the north hill. And what's interesting, Isaiah makes kind of that parallel, but every other time, whenever Yahweh comes to help Israel, it's from the south. And it's usually in a covenantal sense. In this case, when Ezekiel sees the summoning and the coming of Yahweh, he is coming out of the north. This is not going to end well. And so that's already the context of chapter 1. All right, so he's seeing all of this bright flashing light. It is lightning, foreboding, verse 5. So what was within it? There were figures resembling 4 living beings, and this was their appearance. They had a human form. Each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and their feet were like calves' hooves, and they gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings on their 4 sides were human hands. As for the faces and the wings of the 4 of them, their wings touched one another. Their faces did not turn when they moved. Each went straight forward. As for the form of their faces, each one had the face of a man. All 4 had the face of a lion. All 4 on the right side, in a bull on the left. And all 4 had an eagle face as well. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out above. Each had 2 touching one another and 2 covering their bodies. And so I think I may have, and I'll just pull this up here. I want to look at my slides. Let's get it here. We actually have, and I may have to skip ahead here just a bit, and then I'm going to come back. I thought I had some pictures here that I wanted to show you.
Oh, yeah.
Are they on that? I'm trying to find the.
They're there.
Sorry, my PowerPoint is moving slow here. Which one is it?
Slide 41.
41? Well, that's the description. Okay. Yeah, starting on page or on slide 41. The descriptions of the living beings. They all had the likeness, and so it describes it. And then if you move to slide 42, the very next one, what Ezekiel is actually seeing here, and there's a lot of iconography related to this, but what he is actually seeing here is what are known as throne bearers or composite iconographic figures that represent almost like, well, they're, you could say angels or cherubim, but there's going to be something more that's going on with these faces. But what he is seeing is very much reflective of these throne bearers of the ancient world. And you'll notice on slide 42, I think it is, yeah, slide 42, down in the, for you, it'd be down in your right-hand corner, you could see that there has wheels on it. That particular platform with angels with wings out. Can you see that? That one there? Yes? You got that?
Yeah.
This is where you start getting this idea of the mobility of a throne. And of course, Ezekiel is very much, has a very unique perspective of this. And let me see, just if you go on to, and I noticed that my PowerPoint is not lined up the way I want. Some got moved around. Sorry. Go to, I think, slide 44, and you'll see throne bearers as well. Can you see that one?
Yep.
Okay. On the throne bearers there, you'll also see that they're composite creatures, yes? Those particular composite creatures, you're seeing they have bodies of, they have legs like a man, eagle's faces, wings as well. This is the description of what Ezekiel is seeing. He is seeing ancient throne bearers. And so for his original audience, they would have quickly made or drew these conclusions. Now, if you go to slide 45, the next one, you see some more of these throne bearers. And then you actually have two that are kind of holding up this winged creature. Can you see that one? We're on that? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, I know it's not up behind me. But on that particular one, what you actually see there is more of that composite with multiple wings and the bodies of, in this case, it's got the lower body of an ox, upper body of a man. Those little winged creatures that winged creature that is above them is actually in the ancient world the depiction of the deity. And so all of the deities that's the way they would depict them, with kind of a man's head. Sometimes there would just be a kind of a flower there or something, but that is the image of the deity. And so they're would bear these images or the gods along. If you go to the next slide, slide 46, here is another perspective. And again, I've given you several of these images to show, kind of give you an idea of what he is seeing. This is very common in the ancient world. This particular drawing where you see multiple tiers, and I will pull this up on my PowerPoint behind me so you can kind of get an idea. So we'll be on the same page here. Just give me a second.
We can see it here.
You can see it there fine?
Yeah, we have the PowerPoint up.
Okay, good. That particular image is actually from ancient Megiddo. They found that at Megiddo, it was actually an ivory and it dates to about, I think, around the 13th century BC. But what's interesting about this particular image is that it gives it probably one of the clearest presentations of the composite creatures that you see reflected in the language description here in Ezekiel 1. And so at the very top, he's going to talk about, as he sees kind of like a firmament, he actually uses that language. It's like a glass or ice. In other words, what they're holding up, in this case, you're seeing wings, but what the throne bearers are holding up are actually the platform on which God is setting. Okay? And so this is a picture of deity. This is a picture of Yahweh coming in all of his glory, and along with it, these throne bearers are carrying him. And this particular image, and I don't know whether how well you can see this, but if you look at, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 different levels on top of the backs of the bulls. In the ancient Near East, it was very common for the the deities to ride upon a bull. This is where you get the kind of the Baal worship idea, where they would set up calves. Remember Jeroboam, after he had split and they'd gone in the north and he set up his own cult sites, what did he set up? He set up calves. Now, I'm sure that he was thinking, well, we won't worship the calf per se. We will worship the invisible deity above the calf. Because all deities, the thinking of ancient Canaanites was that the deities rode on the back of bulls. And there's lots of iconography and stuff that, statues and stuff that have been found in Israel, in the ancient Near East, where we actually have deities riding on the backs of bulls. In this case, what you see is there's 4 divisions of cherubim or separation deities between the God at the very top, those wings, and what is that earthly brick layer at the bottom, the profane. So in the ancient world, the holy was always separated from the profane by these invisible cherubim. Well, wait a second. Where do we see this in the Ark of the Covenant? You have a chest, and you have cherubims whose wings are folded over, and where does God stand? Above them. And so this is very much the iconography of, so this is not only coming out of the temple, it is also coming out of the ancient world. And so Ezekiel, the difference between what Ezekiel is seeing and what would have been in the temple is the fact in this case, the cherubim have multi-faces. And they have, they're composite creatures. And so if you go to the next slide, slide 47, you will actually see in the sense of down in the corner, here is a piece of iconography from ancient Egypt down in the right-hand corner, where you actually have 4 heads or 4 faces on one deity. Now the difference is these 4 faces are all the same. And the reason that they're all the same is some scholars argue that this represents the god Noom. And I've given you, there's a couple images here of the god Noom that we actually have. The middle one there, you can actually see has the ram's head. That's what we found at Makadar the year after Destry found the scarab. That was part of the discovery the same year we found the Hyksos scarab. That was actually, my theory is that was actually the head of the Noom god, the god Noom. And what he did is he represented 4 different levels: Osiris, Ra, Gev, and Shu. So those 4 faces represented 4 deities. Even though it was all subsumed under one god, Noom, this is how they represented deity. Now, hear me well. I am not saying that what Ezekiel is seeing is God in multi-faces. That's not what I'm saying. He is seeing this imagery in the land of Babylon, where they have a multiplicity of deities, and we have this image coming out of the north. It is lightning and flashing and is no doubt freaking them out when he's describing this. Now move to the next slide, slide 48, and you will see that here is an artist's rendition of what he is looking at. He is actually looking at something that has a man, a lion, an eagle, and a bull. And the question is, what is it that he is seeing? There has been a couple ways of interpreting what he is actually, kind of interpretive grids that have been put upon these 4 creatures, or these 4-faced creatures. If you jump to slide 50, which is 2 slides down, so you have this picture. This is what has been argued. Number one, this is the number one interpretation. That's why I say these are great paper topics. They could represent the 4 domains of creation. So you have the king of the beasts is the lion, the king of the air is the eagle, the king of the domesticated animals is the bull, and then you have the man, which is the king of, the human order. The problem with this is that according to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, man is not on par with the 4 creatures, the other creatures. He actually is supposed to be over all of them. So even though that is a dominant interpretation of this particular vision that he's seen about the four creatures, to me it does not make sense, because what it's doing is actually belittling or putting man on par with bulls and with eagles and so forth. And so others have said, well, no, they represent the four gospels. Now, this was more from an allegorical approach that came around with the early church fathers. This is why when you go to certain churches that have stained glass windows and iconography, have you ever seen this before, where they say, well, the Gospel of Mark is this, the John is, for example, Mark is the man, John is the lion, and so forth? That's where this is coming from. It's coming out of Ezekiel. They're trying to make sense of what he's seeing. He's saying, well, they're seeing the four gospels. It's prophetic. And I'm like, no, the original audience wouldn't, I'm sure, read that way. They wouldn't have looked at that and say, hey, that's the four gospels. It's probably not the way they would have read it. Well, you have to chuckle, because some of the early church interpreters, they were kind of crazy in their interpretations. Now, here we have the third one is, they represent the four tribes around the tabernacle. Reuben is the man, Judah is the lion, Ephraim is the ox, and Dan is the eagle. I don't know of anywhere in the text of Scripture where you can find that, other than the Lion of the tribe of Judah. As far as these connections, I have no record I can find, and nothing in history, nothing in the text that actually makes this connection. I think, and this was part of, as you read on or you get into chapter 1, I think that what we're actually dealing with is, if you go to slide 51, that it just happens that at this very time in the history of ancient Babylon, they had a pantheon. And the four chief deities were Nabu, Nergal, Nineve, and Ninurta. Marduk. And so you have these four deities, and what's interesting is they were all represented by a particular icon. And so, for example, Nabu was the face of a man. He was always depicted as a man. Nergal, the god of the underworld and of plague, was pictured as the lion. The eagle was often associated with Nineve. He's also known as Ninurta. He was the god of the chase of war. In other words, the eagle flying and swooping in war, much like the armies would do. And then finally, you have the face of the ox, which is Marduk. And in this case, he was known as the bull or the calf of ancient Babylon. And so here you have, if you read it through this lens, what you have is deities that are now subservient to or underneath of Yahweh, and Yahweh is bringing them from the north. And exactly how did I say Babylon attacked Jerusalem? They come from the north and they attack on the north. And so this imagery, while scholars have struggled a long time with what it is, and just so you know, this particular connection, I did not make it. I wasn't the first one to make this connection. This one actually was made by a scholar back, I think, in the 1940s, where they were doing some research. This guy was doing some research on the pantheons. They just didn't kind of thread it all together and follow it to its natural conclusion. And so I think that what is going on here is that Ezekiel is being given a picture of what is going to happen to Jerusalem and what is going to be the unfolding for Israel or Jerusalem within the next few years. Obviously, they've got a little bit of time. This is 593 when he sees this vision. This is going to be about 7 years prior to the actual destruction. Now, you may say, that is the craziest thing I have ever heard. Well, I think I have some proof here. So if you have a Bible and you step over to, I believe it is chapter, find it here, 21. Chapter 21. Okay, here it is. Chapter 21, verse 18. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, as for you, son of man, make 2 ways for the sword of the king of Babylon to come. Both of them will go out of one land. So in other words, he's talking about the fact that they're coming from Babylon. And make a signpost, make it at the head of the way of the city. You shall mark the way of the sword to come to Rabbah of the sons of Ammon, and to Judah into a fortified city of Jerusalem. For the king of Babylon stands at the parting of the way. So he's going to come, and he is going to go and practice some divination here. And he is going to stand at the head of this, and he is going to use divination. He's going to shake the arrows. This is called bellomancy. And he's going to consult the household idols, and he's going to look at the liver. That's ecstacy. That's another form of divination. Into his right hand came the divination, Jerusalem, to set battering rams, to open the mouth for slaughter, to lift up his voice with the battle cry, and set battering rams against the gates, to cast up rams, to build siege walls. And I will be to them like a false divination in their eyes, and I have sworn solemnly by solemn oaths. Sorry, they have sworn by solemn oaths, but he brings iniquity to remembrance that they may be sieged. So in other words, what Ezekiel is seeing here is that God is going to be over them, and it's going to bring the nation of Babylon to Jerusalem. They can go out to Ammon across the Transjordan, or they can come to Jerusalem. And he said, guess what? The judgment is set, and I'm going to bring them all the way to Jerusalem, and I'm going to lead them. This was very common in the ancient world, for when a nation was destroyed or defeated. Well, I think Ed, I think you're the one that were talking about doing a paper on temple abandonment. You will find that when you start researching on temple abandonment, that one of the common themes or motifs is that the nation's deity will depart their own temple and will go and join the forces of the enemy and lead and bring their gods or their armies into the city and destroy it. That's called temple abandonment. In other words, it was the end of the city. If that happened, it was the end of the nation. This you can read on the Lamentations of the destruction of in particular is another one of these. The Book of Lamentations talks about this. And so what you begin to see here is that Ezekiel is seeing that this destruction is coming, foreboding is coming from the north, and this picture of the north, or the picture of these four-faced creatures, are actually the representation of the deities which all the kings would have marched in front or behind. I don't know whether you're familiar with the reason why the Jews revolted in 70 AD. Does anybody know, or 66? Why did the Jews actually revolt?
What year?
What's that?
What year? What year did you say?
In 70 AD.
78.
Or 66. It starts in 66. But what was the thing that spurred them to revolt?
Being taxed too much.
Speak into the computer.
Being taxed too much?
Okay. Was it simply taxation? They've been taxed for a long time. What did the Romans want to do, especially under Pilate and some of these guys?
Oh, they
Later.
wanted the Israelites to worship their gods as well, or at least acknowledge them.
Yeah.
They wanted that, and they wanted to set up the standards of their units, their armies. They wanted to march into Jerusalem with the standards of their gods in front of them. And the Jews said, no, you do not enter Jerusalem bearing the images of your gods. And of course, ultimately, this is what causes a revolt. They had been taxed. I mean, it was a combination of things, but that was the straw that broke the camel's back. You do not put the image of your God, because all of the Roman legions, and this was common in the ancient world, they marched into battle with their standards of their gods in front of them. So we know, for example, from the period of the Battle of Kadesh, we'll go all the way back when the Egyptians were fighting the Hittites, and you start doing research on the names of their divisions, and guess what the names of their divisions are? Set. They're using the names of their gods for their divisions. And so the Babylonians did the same thing. They have this concept that they're fighting in the name of their gods, and their gods go before them in battle. Now, I want you to stop and consider something. What is it, or where do we see this actually in the biblical text? Does Israel ever do this?
Yes. Well, not exactly. They march under the colors of their tribes, the symbols of their tribes.
And what marches in front of them?
God in the pillar of smoke.
Okay, so when they're marching in the wilderness, yes, but when they're going into battle, when they cross the Jordan to attack Jericho, what goes first?
Ark of the Covenant.
Ark of the Covenant.
The Ark of the Covenant. What do you think they're doing? They're going into war. Remember what happened in 1 Samuel chapter 4 through 7? They went into battle, and then when they lost in battle, they decided, oh, we'll take the Ark of the Covenant. That's what's wrong. We didn't take our God with us. And so this is very much the thinking of the ancient world. And so while we have a hard time making these connections in the iconography, for them it made perfect sense. They see these images and they're like, oh my goodness, I'm walking around Babylon. Matter of fact, some of these Israelites in the exiles would have been working on these cities. That they were craftsmen. They were the educated or the skilled people. And we actually know, according to Jeremiah, he lists all the people that he took, that Nebuchadnezzar took, and a lot of them were these skilled artisans. And a lot of them would have understood and seen on a daily basis that here is the image of Nabu, here is the image of Marduk, here is the image of Nergal and so forth. And so now what he is actually seeing is these battle standards, and that they are underneath of him, and God is bringing them and moving. Now, I understand that these images are moving, but everything is always at the behest of God. There's no question, because the image is Yahweh is above them all. And he is the one, he's kind of the puppet master pulling the strings. And even though he is going to use a foreign nation and their gods to destroy them, he is the one who is over them. Are there any questions on that? Okay, if you will go to slide 52, and we'll end on this. And then what I'm going to do is at the beginning of next class, I'm going to go back and we'll talk a little bit about theophany, and because this is what he's actually seeing. Ezekiel is seeing a theophany, a revelation of God. And we'll talk a little bit and bring this hopefully into kind of some of the spiritual context as well. But on this particular slide, on slide 52, the Hebrew curse parallels, what I find interesting is that when you start looking at these gods and you start looking at what they represent, for the most part, these are going to unfold in the images of the curses that are going to come upon the people. Remember, what Ezekiel is seeing is a people who are cursed, who are in exile. That's one of the curses. Deuteronomy chapter 28, Leviticus 26 says, if you break covenant with your suzerain, if you break covenant with Yahweh, I will scatter you among the nations. And the curses are going to start unfolding. And that's not the only curse. There's going to be other curses, and you can read those. And if you haven't read Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, I would encourage you before next week to actually read those two chapters. I know chapter 28 of Leviticus or Deuteronomy is kind of long, but you'll kind of get a feel for what these curses actually look like. And so some of the curses that were to come upon Jerusalem were clear within the imagery. So example, death. We're going to see that the idea of death and plague coming upon the people as part of the curse, Leviticus 26:24. And then with the plague, Leviticus 26:21. This could be equated to Nergal. He was the one that brings death to the people. The curse of war was depicted by the god Ninive, Leviticus 26:17. So you have one is kind of the plagues and underworld and death. The other one is war. Then we have, excuse me, all the horrors of being conquered were being announced and revealed symbolically. And of course, Nabu was the great god of destinies. Excuse me. as the God of destinies, he recorded everything that was to take place and everything that was going to, what had happened in the past and what was going to be in the future. And so I can almost see Ezekiel as he's recording this and picturing this vision that he has received from God, kind of tongue in cheek, and how his audience probably would have taken this. And finally, of course, Marduk would have been the leader. He was the chief god of all the pantheon. Marduk was always the one that was seen in Babylon, at least at this time period, as being the chief deity. What's going to be interesting is by the time you get over to chapter 10, when he sees the exact same vision, there is going to be a face of he's going to reinterpret these faces. And he is going to say, oh yeah, there is a lion, there is a man, there is an eagle, but the bull face is now gone. In the biblical text, what we are going to see is God is never, any cherubims, any of these are never likened to bulls. But when Ezekiel sees the vision of the departing of Yahweh's glory in chapter 8 to 10, and chapter 10 in particular, he is going to reinvest that language of the four faces. He's going to remove the bull's face, and he's going to call it a cherub. So in other words, all of those other faces, at some point, the lion can be associated with God, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. The eagle can be associated with God based upon Deuteronomy. He is the eagle who carries you and picks you up on eagle's wings. He is depicted as incarnate. He appears incarnate throughout the biblical text, both to Abraham, to obviously in Christ ultimately. But throughout, you see him, when he does appear in the form, he always appears in the form of a man. He never appears in the form of a bull. Never is this likened. And so what happens, Ezekiel is going to remove that imagery. So for next week, I think what we'll do is I will finish unpacking chapter 1, and we'll move on and try to finish out up into chapter 3. I'm not exactly sure how far we'll get, but we will just keep on. We're now plugging through the book of Ezekiel. But please do read on, and if you have any questions from your reading, please make note of them, and we will start next week with Q&A. Are there any questions before I sign off?
I had just a quick question about the wheel in a wheel.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess the wheel in the wheel is like where they have the, the axle coming across.
Right.
Is that what the wheel in the wheel
Well,
is?
this is one of the things that scholars to this day really do not have a good grasp of what that is represented. Some see it almost like have depicted it almost like a coaster, where you can have you ever seen like on the bottom of a stand that can move in any direction? It's kind of like a wheel set up inside. I think that is what he is seeing.
Yeah,
that
roll, because, or like what I was thinking is a ball, like this, so like a wheel like this and a wheel like this, and so that no matter which way you would go, it's like a ball that it's on.
Yes, I think that's what he's seeing. It's
like
that wheel within the wheel.
It's like a really good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
I didn't see it at all, like the axle with the wheel and stuff. I didn't see it like that. Whenever I was
no. What I'm saying is that's some of the when I showed you the one, that icon earlier, and I say you're already seeing in that imagery the mobility with the wheel.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily what Ezekiel is seeing. Ezekiel, I think, is seeing something almost where it can move in this direction or that direction without ease. And the importance of it is that God is not limited whether he is bringing armies. He is not limited in moving in one. He can move in any direction at any time that he wants. And what it's showing is God's sovereignty over the mobility, figuratively, metaphorically, over his mobility to do and move and act in any way he sees fit. We're going to talk about the eyes as well and unpack some of those things, because this is all iconography from the ancient world. So bring your questions, read chapters 1, I think whatever I have assigned there for your chapters, and we will have some fun unpacking these opening chapters.
Alrighty.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See ya. Have a great week.
Did you see that thing hadn't loaded?
Hmm?
Did you see what I was showing you, that it hadn't loaded?
I did.